Today I would like to show you the difference between a dry pastel pencil and an oil pastel pencil. I will show you the difference in the material and how other art materials react to both. So let's open the golden magic box and find out. I'll be using approximately the same colors of the dry pastel and the oil pastel pencils. We'll be using a white, a black, a purple and a blue. Those are the dry pastels, and now we're going to the oil pastel. A white, a black, a purple and a blue oil pastel pencil. These pastel pencils are by different brands to ensure not to favor any particular brand. I have chosen a simple low-grain white paper to show you accurately the pastels. In a high-grain paper, the structure might distract the differences and reactions of the different materials we will be using. I will be showing you the dry pastels on the left, and I'll be doing exactly the same, but with the oil pastels on the right. So let's take one of the dry pastels and see how it works on paper. As you can see, it's high in pigment and high in coverage. The pigments can fully cover the white of the paper. It can easily soften when putting less pressure on, but it crumbles a lot. The crumbles can easily stain the other parts of your work, so be very careful. The oil pastel is high in pigmentation as well, but it takes more pressure to fully cover the white of the paper. Just like the dry pastel, it can easily soften when putting less pressure on the pencil. The dry pastel has a more chalky feel as it contains pigments and chalk. The oil pastels have a more oily texture, which makes sense as they are made of pigments and a wax or oil medium. The disadvantage of the oil or wax medium is that when putting pressure on your pencil to fully cover your paper, you kind of fill the grain of the paper, leaving an oily patch where hardly any other material will attach on top. And I will show you this a little later. The dry pastel doesn't have this, but it crumbles incredibly, which may stain other parts of your project, so be very careful. As you can see, the dry pastel easily blends, whereas nothing happens when you touch the oil pastel. Another major difference is that dry pastels have a matte finish because of the chalk medium. Oil pastels have a more shiny finish, which may give the color a more lively appearance. Let's have a look what happens when we cross the purple with the blue. Oh wow, look at that amazing color. Again, it's high in pigments and has an excellent coverage. Let's look very closely because we're in for a surprise. Pigments and coverage are good on the whites of the paper, but very poorly on the purple color we just did. This is what I talked about earlier. When putting pressure on oil pastels and filling the paper's grain, the oil patch will not allow other material to stick on top, not even its own. You could blend it slightly, but never get a full coverage as the dry pastels do. Just as we saw earlier, the dry pastel you can blend with your finger, but with the oil pastel nothing happens. Often we want to make highlights and shadows in our project. So let's look at the impact of the whites and blacks on both the pastels. It might not come as a surprise that the white dry pastel has good pigmentation and a fairly good coverage. The oil pastel, on the other hand, has more issues with coverage. When you keep going over the same spot frequently, you will slightly blend the white with the color beneath and lighten it, but never as much as the dry pastels. Again, the dry pastel blends very well. Here you can see clearly that the white has blended with the blue and turned into light blue. Because of the crumbs, the light blue can be blended far from the drawing on the whites of the paper. Just as we might expect with the oil pastel, nothing blends. Using black for creating our shadows gives the same outcome as the white, but obviously darker. With dry pastel, there is a good coverage and it's blendable. With the oils, it doesn't attach well to the oil patch, but it does on the other areas, but isn't blendable. Sometimes artists like to use different materials in the same project. Let's try some other materials, and we will start with the pigment liner, which is waterproof on paper. Here I'm showing you what the liner looks on plain paper. As you can see, I can make lines, but it sort of scrapes off the pigment of the page. On the oil pastel I can draw because it's a waterproof liner. Let's look at a pencil. Let's look at a pencil now. Just going to show you. And this is what it looks like on a plain paper. As you can see, I can easily draw on the dry pastel. I can also draw on the oil pastel, but I must tell you that on the oily patch there is less coverage. In some projects, there are small highlights that really need to make a statement and be really white. Many artists then choose to use gel pens to achieve that fine but extreme white highlight. It's difficult to see on the plain paper, but it's really, really white. As you can see, the white gel pen draws on dry pastel, but it has a little trouble getting through the crumbs. As you can see on the oil, I can draw very well, and there's a good coverage of white on top of the oily patch. The gel pen works on both dry pastel and oil pastel. However, on the dry pastel, the gel pen needs a little bit more help to get the full coverage. Let's look at the marker. The marker has a lot of trouble getting its ink to stick on the chalky pigments of the dry pastel. Here I'm just taking the pastel crumbles off on the plain paper. On the other hand, it has no trouble with the wax and the oily patch of the oil pastels. Another material artists love to use is charcoal. I'm just trying to find my soft charcoal pencil. Oh, here it is. As you can see, I can draw quite well on the dry pastel. However, on the oil pastel, absolutely nothing happens when we touch the oil patch. Charcoal can definitely not be used on oil pastel drawings. Not many artists will ever do this, but let's experiment and use a dry pastel on oil pastel. As you can see, you cannot use a dry pastel on an oil pastel drawing. The other way around does work. Oil pastel pencil can be used on a dry pastel drawing. Every artist makes mistakes. The easiest thing to do is to take an eraser and erase your mistake. But the question is, will that work with these pastels? Before you ask me, yes, I know I have the plastic still on. I keep it on so the end remains clean and will not be used by mistake, because I like to keep the sharp edges for when I need a very tiny delicate point erased. As you can see, the dry pastel can be erased. However, the oil pastel cannot. The only thing that happens is the oil patch becomes a huge big mess. I hope I've given you a bit more insight in the difference between dry pastels and oil pastels. If you have any questions, please let me know. In the meantime, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe to be the first to know more secrets professionals will never tell you.